There are exactly 3 rules everyone in Ashwood grows up knowing. Nobody writes them down, but every child learns them before they're old enough to ask questions. Never whistle after midnight. Never go near Blackwater Lake when the fog rolls in. And if someone tells you to forget what you saw, forget it. I broke every single one of those rules. 6 people died. 1 disappeared. And by the time I discovered what had really happened 25 years earlier, I realized the people of Ashwood weren't protecting a secret. They were protecting each other. My name is Emma Carter. I'm 32 years old. And for most of my life, I believed my hometown was just another quiet little town hidden somewhere in the Pacific Northwest. I was wrong. What you're about to hear happened 3 years ago. I've never shared the complete story before. Not with the police. Not with my editor. Not even with the people I trust the most. Because once you understand what really happened in Ashwood, you stop knowing who you can trust. If this recording ever reaches the internet, there's a chance I won't be alive anymore. That isn't paranoia. It's simply how this story ends. So, let me take you back to the afternoon everything began. The call came on a rainy Tuesday while I was sitting in the newsroom of the Seattle Tribune. I almost ignored it. Unknown numbers rarely meant anything good. Usually it was an angry reader, an anonymous source, or someone threatening to sue the paper over a story they'd never actually read. My phone rang a second time, then a third. Something made me answer. Emma Carter? The man's voice sounded old, careful, professional. Speaking. My name is Richard Hayes. I'm an attorney in Ashwood. Ashwood. I hadn't heard that name spoken out loud in nearly 18 years. It hit me harder than I expected, like hearing the name of someone you buried long ago. I leaned back in my chair without realizing it. Go on. I'm calling because your father named you as the sole beneficiary in his will. There was a pause. The kind of pause people use when they're deciding how gently they should ruin your day. I'm very sorry, Miss Carter. Your father passed away 3 days ago. I didn't cry. I wish I could tell you I did. I wish I could tell you I collapsed or dropped the phone or felt something dramatic enough to prove I was still a good daughter. Instead, I stared through the rain-covered window beside my desk and watched people rushing across the street with umbrellas. The city kept moving. Cars honked. Someone laughed outside. Meanwhile, my father had just died, and the world didn't seem to care. Neither did I. At least, that's what I told myself. My father and I hadn't spoken in almost 8 years. Not because we'd had some explosive argument. Not because one of us hated the other. Our relationship had simply faded. Every birthday, he'd leave a voicemail. Every Christmas, he'd mail a card. I stopped replying after a while. It was easier that way. Or so I believed. The last message he ever left me was only 12 seconds long. Happy birthday, Em. He was the only person who still called me Em. If you ever decide to come home. A long silence. The house will be waiting. I deleted the message. 2 weeks later, I emptied the trash folder. I remember thinking there was no reason to keep it. Funny how we always believe there will be another chance. I know this is difficult, Mr. Hayes said gently. Your father also left you his property on Pine Street. Pine Street. I could picture it instantly. The white house. The cracked front porch. The old maple tree that dropped red leaves across the yard every autumn. I hadn't thought about that place in years. Not consciously. Memory has a strange way of hiding things from you until someone says the right words. Then suddenly, everything comes back. The smell of wet pine after the rain. The church bells every Sunday morning. The diner on Main Street where everyone knew everyone else's name. And the feeling, the constant, impossible feeling, that the town was watching you. I used to think that was just childhood imagination. I know better now. I'll email you the paperwork, the attorney continued. If possible, we'd appreciate it if you could come to Ashwood this week. I'll think about it. Before hanging up, he hesitated. There is one more thing. What is it? Your father left a handwritten instruction. I frowned. He specifically asked that no one enter his study until you arrived. Why? I asked him. I'm afraid he didn't explain. The line went quiet. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then he added something I didn't understand until much later. He seemed convinced you would know what to look for. I almost laughed. He had no idea how wrong that was. Because if there was one thing I was absolutely certain of, it was that I never intended to go back to Ashwood. I had escaped that town at 14 years old. I had built an entirely different life. A different career, different friends, different memories. As far as I was concerned, Ashwood belonged to my past. I didn't know then that my past had been waiting for me all along. I should have stayed in Seattle. I've replayed that decision in my head more times than I can count. If I'd ignored the phone call, if I'd signed the paperwork remotely, if I'd let the county auction off the house, none of what happened afterward would have happened. At least. That's what I used to believe. Now I'm not so sure. Because after everything I've learned, I don't think I was the one who chose to go back to Ashwood. I think Ashwood had been waiting for me all along. 3 days later, I packed a single suitcase into the trunk of my car and started driving north. It was supposed to be a simple trip. Drive to Ashwood. Meet the attorney. Sort through my father's belongings. Sell the house. Leave. I even made myself a checklist. 2 days. 3 at the most. I had deadlines waiting for me in Seattle, and my editor wasn't exactly thrilled that I was taking unexpected leave. Family emergency? He asked. Something like that. He nodded without asking questions. People tend to respect silence when they think it's about grief. The truth was, I wasn't grieving. Not yet. Grief is strange. Sometimes it arrives immediately. Sometimes it waits until years later. When you're standing in a grocery store and suddenly remember the sound of someone's laugh. At that moment, all I felt was obligation. The kind you can't escape just because you've spent years pretending it doesn't exist. The closer I got to Ashwood, the emptier the roads became. Interstate highways turned into 2-lane roads. The 2-lane roads became narrow stretches of cracked asphalt cutting through endless forests. The radio lost signal almost an hour before I reached town. Static filled the car. I switched stations. More static. Another station. Nothing. Eventually, I turned it off. The silence somehow felt louder. It started raining about 20 miles outside of Ashwood. Not a heavy storm, just that slow, steady drizzle that never seems to end. The windshield wipers swept back and forth in perfect rhythm. For some reason, that sound reminded me of childhood. My father loved driving in the rain. He used to say rain made people honest. When it rains, he'll tell me, everyone looks at the road instead of each other. I never understood what he meant. Back then, the welcome sign appeared through the mist exactly where I remembered it. Welcome to Ashwood.
Population 4,213.
I slowed down instinctively. Something felt off. It took me a few seconds to realize what it was. The population number. When I was 14, the sign had read 4,217. 4 people. 4 names erased from the town. No explanation. No replacement. Just gone. I told myself I was being ridiculous. People move. People die. That's life. Still, I couldn't stop staring at those numbers in my rearview mirror as I drove past. Ashwood looked almost untouched by time. The same brick buildings lined Main Street. The same flower baskets hung from old-fashioned street lamps. The diner still had the faded red neon sign I'd seen thousands of times as a kid. Mel's Diner. The movie theater was still advertising films on a hand-painted board instead of digital screens. Even the old barber shop still had the same striped pole spinning lazily outside. It should have felt comforting. Instead, it felt like walking into a photograph. Everything was exactly where I remembered it. Too exactly. As if the town had decided one day to stop changing. People noticed me almost immediately. A woman pushing a stroller looked up as I drove past. An elderly man sitting outside the hardware store lowered his newspaper. Two teenagers stopped talking in the middle of the sidewalk. None of them smiled. None of them waved. They just watched. Maybe I imagined it. Maybe they were simply curious about a stranger. Except I wasn't a stranger. I realized that when I stopped at the first traffic light. An old man crossing the street looked directly into my car. His face lit up with recognition. He removed his cap, gave me a small nod, then quietly mouthed 2 words through the rain-speckled windshield. "Welcome home." He couldn't possibly have recognized me. I'd left nearly 2 decades ago. I was a teenager then. Now I was 32. People change. Faces change. Lives change. So how did he know exactly who I was? I looked in the rearview mirror. He was still standing in the middle of the crosswalk, watching my car disappear. The house sat exactly where it always had, at the end of Pine Street. White paint, green shutters, a wraparound porch. The giant maple tree in the front yard looked older, its branches stretching across almost half the property. Autumn hadn't arrived yet, but a few red leaves had already begun collecting along the walkway. I parked the car, turned off the engine, and just sat there. The house didn't look abandoned. If anything, it looked lived in. The lawn had been mowed recently. The flower beds were neatly trimmed. Someone had swept the porch. That surprised me. My father had lived alone for years. He'd had arthritis in both hands. Keeping the property this clean would have been difficult. So who had been taking care of it? The attorney? A neighbor? Or someone else? I stepped out of the car. The air smelled exactly the way I remembered. Wet pine, damp soil, wood smoke drifting from somewhere nearby. For the first time since leaving Seattle, I felt something I couldn't quite explain. Not fear, not sadness, recognition, as though the town itself had taken a slow, quiet breath, because I'd finally come back. I took my suitcase from the trunk and walked toward the front door. Halfway there, I stopped. There was something on the porch. A small flower pot. Underneath it was supposed to be the spare key. I remembered that because my father had hidden it there for years. I lifted the pot. Nothing. I checked underneath it again. Still nothing. For some reason, that bothered me more than it should have. I stood there staring at the empty space beneath the pot. Then I noticed something. The front door was slightly open. Not unlocked. Open? I was sure I'd seen it closed from the street. I looked around. Pine Street was empty. No cars. No pedestrians. No movement behind the neighboring windows. Just the sound of water dripping from the roof. I should have called the police. Instead, I pushed the door open. "Hello?" My voice sounded strangely small inside the house. No answer. I stepped inside. The first thing I noticed was the smell. Old wood, dust, and something else. Something faintly sweet, like lavender. My mother used to wear lavender perfume. I hadn't smelled it since I was 6 years old. I stood completely still. My heart started beating faster. There was no reason for me to associate that smell with my mother. It had been 26 years. Memory doesn't work that way. Smells don't survive that long. At least. I told myself they didn't. I closed the door behind me. The house looked exactly as I remembered it. The same narrow hallway. The same wooden staircase. The same framed photographs hanging along the wall. Except there was one difference. The photographs had been turned around. Every single one. I walked closer. My father's wedding photo. Face down. A picture of me at 8 years old. Face down. A picture of my mother holding me in front of the house. Face down. I reached for it. My fingers stopped just before touching the frame. I don't know why. Something inside me said not to. So I kept walking. The living room was clean. Too clean. There wasn't a single layer of dust on the furniture. The fireplace had been recently swept. There was fresh wood stacked beside it. Someone had been taking care of this house. That much was obvious. I walked into the kitchen. A coffee mug sat beside the sink. There was still a dark ring of coffee inside it. I touched the cup. It was cold, but not dusty. I looked at the calendar hanging on the refrigerator. The last date circled was 3 days earlier. The day my father died. Underneath the date, he'd written something. Just 2 words. She's coming. I stared at them for a long time. Then I laughed. Not because it was funny, because sometimes your brain doesn't know how else to react. Maybe he'd written it for someone else. Maybe he was expecting a friend. Maybe he'd been confused. Old people sometimes write strange things. There had to be a reasonable explanation. I needed to believe that. I put my suitcase in the guest bedroom and went downstairs. The house was quiet. Too quiet. I checked every room. The bathroom. The kitchen. The basement. Nothing. No one. Eventually, I found the study. The door was closed. I remembered what Richard Hayes had told me. Your father specifically asked that no one enters his study until you arrived. I stood outside the door. For some reason, I felt nervous. I reached for the handle, then stopped. My father's voice came back to me. Not from a recording, from memory.
If you ever decide to come home...
I opened the door. The study smelled like tobacco. My father hadn't smoked in more than 20 years. But the smell was unmistakable. I walked inside. Books covered 3 walls. Newspapers were stacked beside the desk. Folders. Notebooks. Old photographs. Everything looked exactly as though he had been working there the night before. I sat in his chair. It creaked under my weight. For a moment, I closed my eyes. I could almost hear him.
You're sitting too close to the desk, Em. Stop tapping your foot. You're going to ruin your eyesight reading in the dark.
I opened my eyes. The room was empty. I swallowed hard. Then I noticed the desk. One drawer was slightly open. I pulled it. Inside were pens, receipts, batteries, an old pocket knife, and a yellow envelope. My name was written across it. Emma. I stared at it. The handwriting was unmistakable. My father's. I opened it. There was no letter, just a small brass key, and one folded piece of paper. I unfolded it. There was only one sentence. If you're reading this, they know I left the key for you. I read it again, then again. My hands began to shake. I turned the paper over. Nothing. I looked inside the envelope. Empty. I picked up the key. It was old. Heavy. The kind of key you don't see anymore. I turned it over in my fingers. There was a number engraved on one side.
17.
I had no idea what it meant. Then I noticed something underneath the desk, a small wooden panel. It wasn't part of the floor. It was a hidden compartment. I got down on my knees. There was a tiny keyhole. I tried the brass key. It fit. The lock clicked. Inside was a notebook. Black leather. No title. No date. I opened the first page. My father had written, Ashwood 1991. I froze. The year 1 was born. I turned the page. There were names. Dozens of them. People I recognized, people I didn't. At the top of the first page were 6 names circled in red. I stared at the 4th name. Samuel Carter. My father's name. The 5th name was crossed out. The 6th had been completely blacked out. I turned the page. A newspaper clipping had been taped inside. The headline was almost unreadable, but I could make out the date, October 17th, 1991. Then the words, "Local boy missing after community festival." I stopped breathing. I read the article. A 9-year-old boy named Evan Miller had disappeared during the Ashwood Harvest Festival. No body was ever found. No suspect was ever arrested. The article said the boy was last seen near Blackwater Lake. I kept reading. Then I saw something that made my stomach drop. The article included a photograph, a group of children standing outside the festival grounds, and there I was, a baby, in my mother's arms. I stared at the photograph. My mother was smiling, but my father wasn't looking at the camera. He was looking at someone standing behind it. I turned the page. There was another photograph. This one was older. It showed 6 adults standing beside the lake. My father was one of them. So was Sheriff Daniel Brooks. And so was the town's mayor. The same people who were still living in Ashwood when I returned. Someone had drawn a circle around one person in the photograph. A little boy, Evan Miller. But there was something strange about the picture. Evan wasn't standing with the other children. He was standing beside my father, and my father was holding his shoulder, as if he was protecting him. I turned another page. There was only one sentence. Evan did not disappear at the lake. My heart began pounding. I turned the page again. A blank. Another page. A blank. Then another. Nothing. The notebook ended there. I sat in my father's chair for several minutes. I couldn't explain what I was feeling. My father had spent years investigating a missing child, and he'd never told me. Not once. Why? I looked at the photograph again. Something bothered me. Something small. Something I couldn't place. I picked up a magnifying glass from the desk. I studied the photograph. The people. The trees. The lake. The children. Then I saw it, behind my father, half hidden between 2 trees. There was a house. An old white house. I recognized it immediately. Men. The house on Pine Street. But that was impossible. The photograph was taken beside Blackwater Lake, and our house was almost 3 miles away. There was no way the house should have been visible from there. I stared at the photograph until my eyes hurt. Then I heard something upstairs. A floorboard creaked. I froze. Another creak. Slow. Heavy. Someone was walking across the second floor. I stood up. Hello? Silence. Then another footstep, this time closer to the stairs. I reached for the old pocket knife on my father's desk. I don't know what I thought I was going to do with it. I walked toward the hallway. Another step. Then another. I looked up at the staircase. Nothing. The hallway was empty. I waited. 5 seconds. 10. Then I heard a door close upstairs. I climbed the stairs. Slowly. The hallway was dark. My old bedroom was on the left. My father's bedroom was on the right. At the very end was a small storage room. The door was open. I hadn't opened it. I walked toward it. The floor creaked beneath me. I reached the doorway. Nothing. Just boxes. Old furniture. A broken lamp. Then I noticed something on the floor. A child's red shoe. I stared at it. It was small, maybe a size 3. I picked it up. Dust covered the top, but the bottom was wet. Fresh mud. Someone had brought it into the house. Recently. I dropped it. Then I heard breathing. Behind me. I turned. Nothing. The hallway was empty. I stepped backward. My shoulder hit the wall. And that's when I noticed something scratched into the wallpaper. 3 words. You came back. I didn't move. I couldn't. For several seconds, I simply stared at those words. Then my phone rang. I nearly dropped it. The screen showed an unknown number. I answered. Hello? No one spoke. I could hear breathing. Slow. Heavy. Then a man's voice whispered, Emma. I knew that voice. I'd heard it once before. When I was 14, the night my mother disappeared. I couldn't speak. The man whispered again, "Don't open the basement door." Then the call ended. I stood in the hallway staring at my phone. My hands were shaking. Because there was one problem. I hadn't told anyone I was going to Ashwood. Not the attorney. Not my editor. Not my friends. And as far as I knew, no one even knew I had arrived. I looked toward the staircase, then toward the basement door. It was closed. I don't know why. Maybe I wanted to prove to myself that I wasn't afraid. Maybe I wanted to prove the caller was bluffing. Or maybe some part of me already knew what I was going to find. I stood in front of the basement door. There was a lock. Old. Rusty. I reached for it, then stopped, because from the other side, I heard 3 slow knocks. Knock, knock, knock. I stepped backward. Another 3 knocks. Knock, knock, knock. And then I heard a voice, a child's voice. Very quiet, almost too quiet to understand. "Emma?" I couldn't breathe. The voice spoke again. "Is that you?" I knew that voice. Or at least, I thought I did. It sounded exactly like the voice of the boy in the photograph. Evan Miller, the boy who disappeared 25 years ago. And somehow, someone was standing on the other side of my father's basement door, waiting for me. To be continued.